Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, welcome. My name is Steve Coll, and I'm the president of the New America Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to our conference. We've got a full house today, obviously. Some of you are standing in the back. Please be courteous to everybody. If there's empty chairs, put your hand up and guide people to them. And if you are sitting on furniture in the back and stuff, just be aware of your neighbors and don't stampede. This is an event as part of a partnership called the Future Tense Partnership, which brings together the New America Foundation, where you are today, Slate magazine, our partners in this and other endeavors, and Arizona State University. It was born last year for the purpose of trying to bring to Washington policy discussions about how technology was changing the world that Washington routinely makes assumptions about, and to try to look a little bit further over the horizon than discourse in this town sometimes allows, with particular reference to upheavals and disruptions and changes created by technological innovation. I suppose if we had been brilliant at this endeavor a year ago, we would have talked about how social media and digital technology were going to upend authoritarian governments in the Middle East, but here we are catching up with that subject and trying to look ahead around the corner. We're very pleased as well today to welcome Michael Posner, the Assistant Secretary of State, who's going to make keynote remarks and catch us up on the Obama administration's internet freedom agenda after this initial conversation that I'll hold with Sammy in Tunis. I just wanted to acknowledge him and thank him for being with us today. And you can, we are streaming live. There are a couple of cameras here. We're also broadcasting this live. So just be aware when questions from the audience come up as part of the program over the afternoon. You're on the record. Please wait for a microphone. Please ask questions that are succinct and relevant to the folks who are talking up on the stage, and try to avoid long speeches and comments. And you can also follow along whether you're here or watching online. There's a Twitter conversation that's at the hashtag 140REV, 140Rev. So with that, I'm going to rely upon the magic of Skype. Sammy, can you hear me? Audio. It sounds like you can hear me, but we can see you, but we're having trouble hearing you so far. So why don't you just say another hello, and we'll see if we've fixed it.
Yes. Hello, everybody.
Great.
I can hear you.
Great.
Well.
Hello, Sammy. Well, thank you for being with us. Good to see you again. And I wanted we only have 20 minutes to sketch a conversation about obviously a very complicated subject that you've been centrally involved in. But I wanted actually to ask you to tell the audience here a little bit about Nawat and the origins of online activism, blogging, and social media in Tunisia during the authoritarian period in the years before the revolution gathered momentum. Tell us how this began and what did the activity consist of, and how did it lead to the position that these activists were in December?
Okay, thank you, Steve, for the invitation. Thank you all for being there. Well, the blog Nawat is a collective blog dedicated to provide a platform for anyone, mainly bloggers and digital activists, to publish their writing about issues that concern them and concern political life and social and economic situation in 2004. And Nawat means in Arabic the core. The online media scene in Tunisia, we can bring it back to the late 90s, the beginning of 2000s, when we've seen a few initiatives first coming from the civil society, some political party like the Congress for the Republic, which actually started building forum board and websites dedicated to publish his political views and discuss and debate the situation in Tunisia. And then we've seen Takriz.com, which is a website mainly run by teenagers at that time. And they were using very social and popular language outside of the box. Then we've seen a popular forum which was called Tunisian, run by Zuhair Yahyawi, the first cyber dissident who was jailed in Tunisia in 2001, for publishing a poll asking the visitor of the forum to vote whether Tunisia was a zoo or a prison or a republic. And then we've seen, since the beginning of that arrest of Zuhair Yahyawi, we've seen a lot of activists and human rights advocates gathering around that website, defending and mobilizing the international public opinion and Tunisians themselves to support the case of Zuhair Yahyawi, who passed away 18 months after his release from prison in 2003. And then we've seen the arrest of the youth of Zarzis in 2003. There were around 7 young people who were arrested for accessing opposition websites. They were accused for downloading materials and documents about how to manufacture a bomb, etc., which were accusations like manufactured by the justice system under Ben Ali's regime. At that time, the censorship of online platforms were only targeting clearly websites that are dedicated to criticize the government in Tunisia. And with the emergence of the phenomenon of blogs starting from 2003, 4, and 5, we've witnessed a wave of censorship targeting those blogs. And we've witnessed also a self-censorship coming from the Tunisian bloggers as well, who were avoiding discussing any political issues. We've seen only few hardcore bloggers who are dedicated to talk and debate the political situation under the dictatorship, and mainly dedicating their time and energy and creativity and platform to fight against the online censorship. And that fight, breaking the wall of the fear that was, as we can remember, handicapping the Tunisian activists from talking about sensitive issues, were the main fight that gathered online activists around the battle to gain free access to information and free dissemination of information online. And then we've seen a massive blocking of social media platform. In the beginning of 2007, Tunisia blocked access to the popular video sharing website Dailymotion, then YouTube. In 2008, they tried to block Facebook during 10 days, but the protest was so high that Ben Ali unblocked the websites after that protest. In 2010, we've seen the blocking of all video sharing websites in Tunisia, Blip TV, Fimayo, Mita Cafe, Vat TV, Flickr.com, etc. And this can explain why the Tunisian internet activists gathered around Facebook, simply because Facebook was the only remaining platform, social media platform in Tunisia that was unblocked. And we can ask ourselves why during the revolution the President Ben Ali didn't block Facebook. He was aware that Facebook represents a very dangerous platform where Tunisians were organizing and mobilizing the public opinion during the protest. But he was afraid that blocking the social media platform Facebook will fuel the protests, and that's how we can understand the theory why Ben Ali didn't block Facebook during the revolution. But the online activism actually bridged the gap in a way between the civil society, NGOs, traditional human rights advocates, and the cyber dissidents movement, who were mainly very independent and very critical towards the government of Ben Ali and towards the action of the opposition that were at that time very unpopular, very ideological in their discourse, etc. So in a way, the censorship really killed the online content in Tunisia. We've witnessed a massive migration from blogs to Facebook. We've witnessed migration from YouTube, LibTV, Vimeo, Dailymotion to Facebook, from Flickr to Facebook. And in that regard, Facebook became the hub in which normal internet users, political activists, human rights advocates, political party, opposition figures gathered together and managed to mobilize the entire population, starting from the second week of the revolution. And on the meantime, the online censorship in Tunisia created a generation that knows how to circumvent censorship, that knows how to use proxy, that knows how to secure their communication channels, despite the fact that Tunisia during those years were using Gmail phishing, Facebook phishing. They were cracking and hacking many accounts on Facebook and on Gmail and spying and monitoring the activity of online activists. And we've witnessed the arrest of many activists before and during the revolution, thanks to those techniques of Gmail and Facebook phishing. But in general, that censorship created a generation that was tech savvy, very consciousness about the context in which they can use the tools and implement them in their own context.
So, Sammy, thank you very much for that. And I should have introduced you properly. I think many people here know about you, but for those among us who don't, Sammy is the Advocacy Director of Global Voices, which is an international community of bloggers and citizen journalists and writers around the world. And that he is, as he described here, the co-founder of Nawat. And Sammy is a Tunisian. He's from a town called Bizerte, about 100 clicks from Tunis. And he was forced into exile himself, around 2000?
98.
98. And from Europe and other places, he organized much of the activity that he just described. And I think one of the themes in that very cogent narrative that he just provided is that the internet activism and the Facebook activity that burst into the West's view last winter had very, very deep roots, involved diverse organizations, those online and off. And then the second fascinating theme that he just described about how the strategy of censorship of the Tunisian government by knocking out YouTube and Flickr essentially forced everyone onto the Facebook space and connected apolitical and political communities, and that Ben Ali could not shut that space down because he was frightened of the consequences in the apolitical audience that was there. Sammy, we just have a couple of minutes left, regrettably, but I want you to take those minutes and talk to us about where we are now. One observation that's made about the Facebook revolutions in the West is that the nature of the organizing, the communities, the decentralized community and the ethic of those communities hasn't yielded leadership of a traditional political type, that there's a great powerful sense of possession and engagement with the achievements of the revolution by those who brought it into being, as we see today, even now in Tahrir Square. But the question is, where does the next phase come from? What is the situation in Tunisia today among the communities that brought the revolution into being? Yeah. And what are your thoughts about how this will translate into sustained political change or fail to do so?
Well, briefly, I tend to disagree with that remark that the revolution in Tunisia and even in Egypt was leaderless. I mean, on the macro revolutionary movement in Tunisia, there was no central leadership like leading and organizing and mobilizing the masses. But on the regional and the city level, in every city, in every neighborhood, there were leaders who were mobilizing and organizing and scanding those slogans that were highly politicized. So I tend to disagree that the revolution has no leadership. I mean, the challenges now that we are facing, mainly in Tunisia, is regarding the defense of the online freedom of expression and the repuzzling and rebuilding the media scene in Tunisia. I mean, we've seen a free internet in Tunisia weeks after the fall of Ben Ali, and then we've witnessed the return of the online censorship. First, they blocked for Facebook pages under libel and call to violence. And the block was ordered by a military court, and then we've seen a court ordering overblocking of all pornographic websites in Tunisia, which I think is very worrying development. And we have a lot of activists and advocates in Tunisia who are dedicating their time and energy to try to convince the lawyer and the court about the uses of the online censorship as implemented within the hands of a central body, which is the Tunisian Internet Agency. Regarding the media scene, I think the centralized media ecosystem in Tunisia is based in Tunis, the capital, and those regions, those marginalized regions that triggered the revolution are still voiceless. And we've witnessed many citizen media platforms popping up from the ground, trying to give voices to the voiceless, and through online TV, through online radio, through online platform. And I think this is a very huge challenge that we need to understand and to deal with. The other thing is this conflict between the old generation who lived under Ben Ali and many who were part of the former ruling party who are reconverting themselves into new political parties in order to not to lose the spaces that they were monopolizing, and the dynamic of the revolution, which is sometimes very radical and not pragmatic in their demand and in their approach on how to reach those demands. So it is a very healthy situation in which we are witnessing a very healthy debates and reshaping of the Tunisian identity. The Islamist and the laicist school in Tunisia are really fighting openly against each other. But I think this is a very healthy situation. It is the first time that Tunisia lives under a sphere of freedom, and I think this kind of debate is welcome. But the challenges is how to reshape the media ecosystem in Tunisia through the use of online platform.
Great. Well, we'll have to leave it there, Sammy, and I know you'll be important in that effort to reshape that ecosystem, and I'm really very grateful to you for taking the time to be with us. And it's a very rare opportunity for us in Washington to hear directly. I hope we can make a habit out of that while you're in Tunis and carrying this work forward. So thank you again for being with us.
Thank you, Steve, for inviting me. Thank you.
I don't think he can hear your applause, but I'm sure he'd appreciate knowing that you offered it. Oh, he can. Excellent. So it's only left for me to introduce Jake Weissberg to move to the next session. Jake is our partner. He's the chairman and editor-in-chief of the Slate Group. He was the editor of Slate itself from 2002 to 2008. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Bush Tragedy, and the co-author of a book called In an Uncertain World, which is also an appropriate basis for this transition at the podium. Jake Weissberg.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. I just want to say that Slate is extremely proud of this partnership with the New America Foundation around the Future 10 series, and this event is absolutely what we were going for, the kind of thing we were trying to accomplish when we came up with this idea. I want to introduce Michael Posner. Michael is Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, where he's been since 2009 at the State Department. Before that, he was the Executive Director, then the President of Human Rights First. Some people may remember that was the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, I believe, before it was Human Rights First. And he's had a long and distinguished career in this field. He played a key role in the campaign for the American Law for Political Asylum, which happened in 1980, and also in the creation of the International Criminal Court. One of his less frequently cited distinctions is that he's a graduate of Francis Parker School in Chicago, where, as it happens, I also went. Michael is going to make some remarks, and then I'm going to follow up with some questions.
Thanks, Jay. Great. Well, thanks, Jake. It's really great to be here. I want to thank Slate, the New America Foundation, and Arizona State University for sponsoring today's conversation on internet freedom, which I believe is one of the game-changing human rights issues of our time. I also want to thank Andres Martinez for inviting me here. We've known each other a long time in lots of different capacities, and it's great to be reconnected. I get a lot of invitations to speak these days, but most of them are a lot less cool than this one. Usually the cool invitations go to my colleague Ian Schuler, who's our resident techie in the Bureau of Human Rights, Democracy, and Labor. Ian's going to be speaking later this afternoon on a panel with Sasha Minrath about the Internet in a Suitcase program that we're doing funding, and that's being done here at New America. I want to thank also Steve Coll for his leadership in that effort. I'm particularly pleased to be here today because as I look around this room, there are so many leaders, policymakers, journalists, techies, activists. I see Rebecca McKinnon in the second row, who's been such a leading voice on these issues for so many years and a great colleague. All of you have helped shape this conversation, and many have helped governments, including our own, come to grips with the challenges and the opportunities that are posed by this transformational set of new technologies. We're excited about the Internet in a Suitcase project, one of a number of cutting-edge technologies and projects we're investing in. It's part of what Secretary Clinton calls a venture capitalist approach to addressing the wide range of challenges that democracy and human rights activists face in internet repressive environments around the world. By the end of this year, my Bureau will have led the efforts within the U.S. government to award $70 million in grants. We're supporting a dozen different circumvention technologies. We're supporting a panic button app for mobile phones, a slingshot program to identify censored content that users searching for in a particular country and then flinging it back over the firewalls where ordinary citizens can get access to it. Training programs to help activists operating in repressive areas to keep operating, thwart surveillance, and protect their privacy. To date, we've trained 5,000 activists in all regions of the world. In short, we're finding a whole slew of new tools and techniques that empower users to gain access to information, organize them, tell their own stories, and to stay safe online. But this is not just about technology. Secretary Clinton has put internet freedom on the map as a diplomatic priority. In our bilateral relationships and in our multilateral relationships, including at the UN Human Rights Council, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which just had a ministerial meeting, and in a range of other places. Many of you here today have urged us not to view internet freedom in isolation, but to wrestle with it with the challenge of integrating internet freedom with national security, combating cyber crime, protecting intellectual property, and other vital interests. And this is what we've done in President Obama's international strategy on cyberspace, which incorporates all of these interests. This is the hard part. It's where Americans disagree not only with repressive governments, but among ourselves. But we agree on the importance of getting it right. By now, every government understands the power of ordinary citizens to harness the internet and social media to organize and express their views. Some have embraced these new technologies as a way to connect and to serve their citizens. Others are redoubling their efforts to control them. We are seeing the development of a more sophisticated set of tools for cyber repression, including filtering, surveillance, anti-circumvention, and network disabling technologies by government security forces in closed societies. We're also witnessing the rise of cyber attacks, of computers, of independent media, distributed denial of service attacks on sites of watchdog groups, and other attempts to thwart the work of civil society. Before I joined this administration, as Jake said, I spent 30 years working on human rights issues from the low-tech NGO side. So now I want to refocus attention not on technologies to fight internet repression, but on the psychology of the repressors. What causes a regime to perceive the internet as such a profound threat that it is willing to damage its country's economy by choking bandwidth, blocking content, or even shutting down the network entirely. These are the acts of governments that fear their own people. In cracking down on the internet, they expose their own lack of legitimacy. But these crackdowns also indicate a basic lack of understanding that free speech, whether it's supportive speech or subversive speech, is harder than ever to suppress in the digital age. And the young people who have taken to the streets across the Arab world this year understand it isn't pornography or pirating that is being suppressed. It's people. It's their demands for dignity, and its say in the political and economic future of their countries. After all, Facebook does not foment dissent. People do. Twitter only amplifies those voices that have the most resonance, those ideas that people find most powerful. As President Obama said in his speech in Cairo in June of 2009, 19 months before the protests in Tahrir Square, suppressing ideas never succeeds in making them go away. 2 billion people today have access to the internet. That's a lot of speech to try to suppress. But in the next 20 years, nearly 5 billion more people will come online. 5 billion. Will they be joining a true global conversation over a single unified global network? Or will they be entering a stilted alternative reality of government-approved content on controlled national intranets? This is the vision of the halal internet being advocated by some in Iran, a course that would only deepen that country's isolation and the Iranian government's estrangement from their own citizens. So let's be honest. Governments that respect the rights of their citizens have no reason to fear a free internet. The internet didn't topple the governments of Tunisia or Egypt. The people did. By smart governments are using social media tools to better communicate with and understand their own people and to deliver services in a more open and accountable fashion. And they are recognizing that free access to tech tools spurs both economic and social progress. If you really want to address popular discontent, you don't need an army of censors deleting posts on social media sites. You need a cadre of government officials reading those posts and figuring out how to identify and address the legitimate grievances that are being expressed there. So don't shoot the instant messenger. Instead, address the underlying grievances. The corruption, the abuse of power, the environmental degradation, the lack of political and economic opportunity, the daily affronts to dignity by indifferent authorities. More than anything else, it is this quest for dignity that has prompted so many young people to walk away from their keyboards and into the streets to demand a chance to build a better future. And it's their vision of the future that really matters. This administration is working to support them. Our work on internet freedom is not about messaging, it's about empowerment. It's up to the people of each country to build societies in which government respect not some rights part of the time, but all rights of the governed every day. The role of the international community is to offer support, technological and institutional. Your generation, the digital natives, has developed new tools with unprecedented potential to empower people around the world to participate in a truly democratic process. The world is eager to see what you will invent next. But we're equally eager for your help in forging international consensus and setting the expectations needed to support internet freedom. It will be up to your generation to make this vision a reality for the 5 billion users by setting the rules of the road for the internet for the 21st century. The human challenge of the internet and internet freedom is to use technological tools to build a different kind of relationship between citizens, civil society, and their governments. A relationship based not merely upon the content of the governed, the consent of the governed, but also broad participation in governance by all citizens. With your help, we'll continue to put U.S. diplomatic power behind this vision and a more inclusive, peaceful, and democratic world. Thank you.
Michael, thank you for those remarks. And just to pick up first on what might be the newsiest part of what you said, we've seen in recent weeks a kind of ratcheting up of the rhetoric from the Obama administration about the crackdown in Syria in particular, and about the legitimacy of that regime. Are you going a little farther than we've heard previously in criticism of the Syrian regime's crackdown?
Well, yesterday I testified in Congress to the Lantos Commission on Syria. My comments very much today reflect what the President said yesterday, what the Secretary of State said the day before. We are increasingly aware that the people of Syria are under the gun, are being attacked for peacefully demonstrating, for organizing, for speaking out about things that have long been human rights violations in that country. And we are committed to reinforcing their voices. This is not about us, it's about the Syrian people. But as we've seen, particularly in the last 6 or 8 weeks, the Syrian people have lost their fear, and they are demanding accountability and openness and a free democratic space which hasn't existed. And we want to be standing behind them.
So maybe talk about Syria a little bit in relation to what happened to Egypt. If you watch this closely and you watch it from the perspective of rooting for the opposition, as I will certainly acknowledge that I have been, you have to ask yourself the question, why did this work in such a dramatic way in Egypt and bring down the government? And why has it so far not worked in Syria, despite, as you say, the courage of these Syrian opposition leaders who are obviously, in some sense, playing for their lives?
You know, as we look around the Middle East region, North African region, the one thing that's more and more obvious is that you have to take each of these countries on their own terms, given their own history and given where they are. There was simply much greater space in Egypt, many more civil society activists, and a greater opportunity for them to come together, and a government that frankly allowed them to demonstrate peacefully. All of those things contributed, but there was a much greater, I would say, opportunity, both in Tunisia but especially in Egypt, for the kinds of protests to succeed. Syria has been a harshly ruled country for many, many years, with a government that doesn't really know boundaries and has used violence in dramatic ways. People were demonstrating in Hama the last 6 weeks. President Assad's father killed at least 10,000 people there in 1982. So the fear factor was greater, and the fact that people have lost their fear and said, whatever happens, we're going to stand in the street, we're not going to be violent, we're going to demonstrate, and if they're going to shoot, they're going to shoot. That's where we are today.
So 3 big factors, and maybe give me a little bit of a sense of how you rate their importance. One is the simple connectedness of a society. In Libya, it's not that connected, which makes things very difficult. Another, arguably the most important, is the underlying strength of civil society that existed before the internet and beyond the internet. And a third, as you were referring to, is how repressive or aggressive or authoritarian the regime has been or is willing to be. Clearly a big factor in Iran. Are those the most decisive factors in the sort of the question of whether this sort of technology-aided opposition can succeed?
Yeah, I think those are the biggest factors. And what's interesting is that even in some of the more closed societies, the Syrians have tried in all sorts of ways to limit connectivity and people being able to communicate. They are communicating, and they're communicating across the country, so you don't just have demonstrations in one town or one region. It's the combination, I would say, of the internet, new technologies, and television. People are seeing images, and they're seeing images of what's happening in the region, and they're also seeing images of what's happening at home. I think those things are driving the discussion, but again, the technology alone isn't enough. People have to be themselves ready to take to the streets or to organize, and civil society organizations in Syria are evolving, but they're coming out of a very tough environment.
How does the Obama administration and how does Secretary Clinton and how do you see the proper role of the United States government in aiding these movements or not? You know, there's been money appropriated to help opposition leaders, opposition figures get around restrictions, firewalls, and so on. But you know, any help we give always comes with the potential stigma that the United States is involved in what would otherwise be an indigenous and local movement. How do you balance those things?
You know, we start from the premise that change occurs most effectively within a society. We can't force it from outside, but we can be helpful in both amplifying the voices of domestic activists who are trying to raise these issues. We can provide some measure of protection to them, and we can help create an international environment where these issues are discussed in a more intelligent way. We try to do all of those things, but we are very mindful of the importance of reinforcing the domestic voices. This is not about us, it's about them. And it's about governments that are refusing to allow their own people to stand up and speak for what they want. They want economic opportunity, they want a job, they want a say in their political future, and they want to be treated with dignity. Those are the basic components, whether you're in Syria or in Egypt or in Libya. And so what our job is, as we see it, is to make sure we stand for international standards of human rights, and we start with the premise that people need to be able to speak their mind and participate in the process.
Yeah, Michael, you know, I think I remember when I was in high school, you coming back to speak, as I said, as a distinguished alumnus and talking about human rights, and I remember it being one of the things that got me excited, really, as a kid about the issue. But as someone who's spent your whole career working on these issues, does the internet really change anything? I mean, are these simply the same liberal principles applied around some new technology and some new techniques, or are things really different in some fundamental way?
You know, I think the answer is it changes a lot. I said in the remarks it's a game changer, but it's essentially taking old values, old human rights principles, free speech, free assembly, free association, and giving them and amplifying them. So now it's not a matter of, you know, doing Samistat, doing, you know, pieces of paper that you hand out in a square. It's opening up to everybody in your society, in fact, everybody in the world. It empowers people. It allows them to do what they've always wanted to do with governments less able to control it. The flip side is that governments are so nervous about this that they've begun to crack down. And so there's sort of a cat and mouse game going on, and we're trying to stay one step ahead of the cat.
Yeah. You know, there's this sort of debate that goes on, which is a little bit frustrating and a little bit simplified, but between the sort of cyber utopians on the one hand who think everything has changed and, you know, the power of this technology is such that repressive regimes over some medium term don't stand a chance. And on the other hand, cyber skeptics who think, wait a minute, a lot of these tools are proving much more effective in the hands of authoritarian regimes than they are in the hands of opposition leaders. And then there are some people in the middle. Where are you in that spectrum?
I call myself a cyber optimist. I don't think it's the answer to everything, but I think it's so much part of the solution. And what the challenges we faced with governments, you know, misusing the technology and you know, imposing censorship and breaking people's right to privacy, I think we just have to figure out how to overcome those things. The reality is the world is very different today because of this ability to communicate, and we need to take advantage of it. It will be to our interest in the long run.
Yeah. How in particular do you think we can help opposition figures, and not just opposition figures, people who want honest information, get around firewalls, and particularly in China? I mean, in China, my sense is that it's not that hard for people who have some technological sophistication to use a proxy server and get around a firewall. But most people don't, either because they're afraid or because it's a hassle or because their opinions actually conform more or less to what they've been given through official sources.
Yeah, you know, I was in China in April. I've been there 3 or 4 times since I'm in this job. And one of the things that's very striking to me is there are a number of Chinese citizens, I wouldn't even call them all activists, but people who have concerns about labor issues, about tainted milk, about the environment, And what they want increasingly is the ability to speak to one another and to get information that exists within that society. We've spent a lot of time trying to think about how to break through a firewall to present our information to them. In fact, there are Chinese that want to know what's happening in the neighboring city, the neighboring village, and they are very resourceful in trying to figure out how to overcome the technical obstacles. I think increasingly the Chinese government and others that put resources to try to stop that are fighting a losing battle. People are demanding information, and they're creative in going and getting it.
Do you think a big shift is going to require some technological breakthrough, like a freedom box that people in this country will have to help Chinese opposition figures, or do you think it's sort of all in place already?
No, I think our role is to keep pushing for an open internet that crosses borders, that's a neutral platform that allows people to use these technologies for whatever purpose, if it's commercial, if it's for educators, for innovators, or it's for activists. I think our job is to protect the space that's been created so wonderfully and prevent governments from trying and others from trying to restrict it in ways that will make that less effective.
Now, when you talk about restriction and censorship on the internet, someone does have to censor the internet. I mean, when you think about it, you and I would agree that there's certain things that should not be allowed, whether it's child pornography or information about manufacture of nuclear weapons. There's some minimum number of things, and we would try to keep them small, that we would agree should be censored. But who should censor them? Right now we have a kind of patchwork of technology companies, ISPs, governments. You know, how do you distinguish the kinds of censorship that's legitimate from the kind that's not, and who should be in charge of it?
We have, before the internet was invented, we've had discussions for years in this country and every country about what are the legitimate controls on speech. And so this is really just the next generation of that. I think we need to find rules of the road, again, that are rooted in what you described. There are clear categories of things like pornography for children or like implements of terrorism and violence that we want to control. Every government tries to do that. But here it's interesting, you have to deal with the range of governments, but also the private sector and the activists and the world of consumers. So finding the way to incorporate all of their interests and at the same time come up with these rules of the road is one of the challenges we face going forward. It won't be easy, but we're going to figure out how to do it.
Is it a national issue? Is it a supranational issue? I mean, what's the body that's going to do that?
I think it's going to be certainly it's a national issue for us in every country, but there has to be some international discussion of that. I can't tell you right now that there's an obvious body to do that, and I think we need to be mindful of the multi-stakeholder, the multiple interests here. It's not just a matter of a dozen governments sitting in a room in Geneva and figuring it out. It's a much more lively discussion, and it should be.
Lastly, I wanted to ask you, Michael, about the big technology companies themselves and their role. Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Yahoo are frequently drawn into these issues around China, around Russia, around their cooperation with regimes or not, about whether they cooperate in censorship. What sort of attitude do you expect or would you like to see from these companies? Should they simply be, as Facebook has portrayed itself, kind of a neutral provider of a service that anybody can use? Or do you see them having a kind of social and human rights responsibility in terms of trying to be helpful to people who are on the right side of these issues?
Well, one of the things that Rebecca and I and others in this room, I'm sure, have worked on is trying to, and this is before I got into government, trying to create some standards or some principles on both internet freedom and privacy for the private sector. There's an organization, a private organization called the Global Network Initiative. And much to their credit, Google, Yahoo, and Microsoft have all participated in that. And I think one of the things that now coming into government I'm very aware of is that we need the private sector to step up. We need them to work with one another to try to find some common guidelines and to really be a partner with governments like ours to try to figure out strategies for challenging both restrictions on free expression and also on privacy.
But you see them having an active role in challenging restrictions.
Yeah, there's a limit to what they can do in a given circumstance, but we need to figure out what are the best practices, what can companies do individually and collectively to push back against governments that are up to no good.
So Facebook approved in China will not be a happy headline from your perspective.
Well, we're not telling any company what to do in a particular country. What we are encouraging is that the companies come together, establish guidelines, live by those guidelines, and then work with us.
Mike, I want to thank you for those comments, and we keep the trains running on time here at Future Tense, and I want to now hand things over to Andreas Martinez. Thank you. I'm sorry. Andreas is the head of the Fellows Program here, and he co-runs the Future Tense program. So, thank you.
Hello. Before we go on to the next segment, just a very quick programming note, which is that as you can see, we're trying to cram a lot into an afternoon, so apologies that we're not getting to question and answers for some of these sessions, but I just want to remind everybody that there will be refreshments at the end of the entire session, and most of the participants will be around and eager for conversation then. So apologies that some of these sessions we're not able to get to Q&As. I also just I wanted to quickly introduce, if you could just sort of wave, Tori Bosch, who is the editor of our Future Tense content on Slate magazine, and there's going to be a lot more of that in coming months. And Joel Garreau, you could take a bow. Joel is a former New America Schwartz Fellow who is now on the faculty of Arizona State University and is my partner in crime in putting together these Future Tense events. Now I'd like to introduce our next segment, which is a presentation by Professor Marlena Lim entitled Friending Revolution, Social Media and Political Change in Egypt and Beyond. And speaking of our content on Slate and our partnership with Slate Magazine, you can see a version of this that's been published on the Slate website. Marlena is a professor at the Consortium of Science, Policy, and Outcomes in the Social Inquiry Program at Arizona State University. She researches the mutual shaping of technology and society, and she's an active blogger who blogs in English, Indonesian, and Sudanese. And we're lucky to have her. Marlena?
Thank you, Andres. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm excited to be here because I've been reading these people's blogs for years, and thank you. So there is a joke that I want to tell. I believe, I think most of you have heard of, but I will tell you anyway. So since afterlife, in the afterlife, there is a so-called presidential lounge where all presidents who die, right, before they have this judgment going to heaven and hell, they have to enter this one. So, and there are two groups of presidents, poison or parade, because most presidents, they die when they're poisoned or being shot at the parades, right? Okay. Kennedy, parade, right? And then Nasser come in and then poison. And then Anwar Sadat, parade, right? And then here is Ben Ali and Mubarak holding hands. They're entering this like, and then poison or parade? There's a poke, Facebook. Poison or parade? Poke, Facebook. Poison or parade? Choose, sir. We were poke on Facebook, okay? So the whole Facebook thing is like so big, and then people call it Facebook revolution, sometimes Twitter revolution, but it's sort of like people, even those people who were on the street there almost believe that it was Facebook, right? But we are here and we agree that it was not Facebook revolution, it was people revolution, right? I think I agree with Mr. Posner, is people did it, right? The question here is not so much about whether it's Facebook or people, because it's certainly people. But the question, what is the actual roles of the social medias? How people use it? How, why, for what? What they were capable to be used for? And what people have to do if we wanted to do that? And I think to be able to understand this, we need to look beyond Facebook. We need to look beyond social media. And if, in fact, we need to look beyond Tahrir Square moment. I hope so. So we agree there's the cause, right? The whole repression, oppression, corruption, poverty, unemployment, they are collective grievance. So they are there, right? Without this, people wouldn't want to join any popular movement. And certainly, I'm talking about Egypt and Middle East. Their corruption perception index is high. Just quickly glance. Youth employment is high. But also, there's other thing. This is that there is a structural dynamic that creates opportunities, right? Without something that creates opportunities, because there are so many people in the world who got this collective grievance, but they couldn't do anything about that. Lucky, like in the Middle East, actually literacy rate is really high. And also, media in general is quite active. You got Al Jazeera, for example, Pan-Arab satellite is there. Internet growth in MENA region is actually 1,900% per year, which is, while the words in general is not per year in the last 10 years, while the words in general is only 426%, right? But we also got something unique, which is the affordance, the combination of youth and social media. The fact that this region, that's China, right? This whole pyramids, the population, that's United States. But this region have this kind of pyramids where young population is high and social media by the youths is really high. Like, really, these people, this is all about these people who are on that range of age, like 15 to 25 or 35, right? And I'm not talking about the roles of social media for democracy at all. I'm specifically talking about mobilization here. How these people mobilize using social media. What is the role of social media? And in fact, this is not about democracy because even if, right, you got to mobilize, it doesn't mean you're gonna have, you would be able to topple the dictator. If you have the regime change, it doesn't mean you're gonna have reform. And it doesn't really transform into democracy altogether. There are a lot of work to be done here. So I just focus on that thing. So here's the thing. Most people like looking at whoa, how did that happen? It's surprising, right? These people like finally we didn't even know they got Facebook. We didn't even know they got young people who are techie, right? That's because we made them invisible. Because how could you understand something when you made them invisible in the first place? Didn't pay attention, right? Very little coverage on Egypt in general on our TV, our newspapers, right? Al Jazeera, perhaps the only one that really have been covering. To understand, every moment actually has a history. It doesn't come from nowhere. Where these people come from? It's not, these people didn't only work for a week or 2 weeks or 2 months, right? If you look at the whole history, whole activism, social society movement, oppositional networks there are a lot of things going on before Tahrir moment. I just point you out, some people pulling out until November, but actually further than that. Some people think, oh, okay, since June, but actually further than that, right? There are more before. This is all recorded, and I might miss some recorded popular movements in Cairo, Alexandria, mostly. And here was the first anti-Mubarak movement, which is December 2004, Kafaya. And if you want to pull further, Kafaya was actually here. The first one actually was able to transform Intifada sentiment into something more internal, into anti-government movement. And it marked the beginning of oppositional Egyptian street politics since then. Like hundreds, literally hundreds of street protests. And what is interesting about Kafaya, okay, I'll just skip that one. So traditional cluster of oppositional networks in Egypt was usually formal, based on parties, Islamists, right, like Muslim Brotherhood, or reformists or leftists. They got Communist Party there. But Kafaya is the first one that is really movement, not really a formal organization. This is a movement, fluid, loose affiliation. It's more like this. The network is more like that. You got Islamists and leftists, actually, and secularists joining the movement, which didn't happen before. And this is also, what is interesting is also, the Kafaya movement was the first that had no permanent meeting place nor headquarters. They use website. One of their meeting place is actually Mr. Digital, which was formed in 2004, while Abbas is the administrator. He is one of the key leaders in Tahrir revolt. And also, these people were blogging. So among the very first generation of bloggers in Egypt, actually mostly are activists. And blogging was very important here because blogging enabled these activists to avoid the crackdown of the government. We are imagining 2004, 2005. The government was behind and not yet there in tracking down. They deliberate over issue and was able to take on, actually, got quite a successful initial success. They were different because the name is simple, Kafaya, enough, right? We got enough with Mubarak. But they're also using ICT, using emails, using mobile phone texting, put line on online banner, and got the some printing version as well. Going to the street, keep going to the street, even when sometime at one time they had they held the protest, 300 people in Tahrir Square. This is back in May 2005, and the 300 of them walking toward Tahrir Square got stopped by 600 police. Like sometimes there are more police, right? But they keep doing it. Sometimes they got success. Actually, occasionally they got thousands. So this kind of thing going on until the government suddenly increased the whole policing the street, really tightly, arrested people, and eventually arrest some bloggers. In 2006, 2007, a lot of arrests on bloggers and the street. And even then, the blogosphere of post-election, especially, the blogosphere of Egypt is thriving. People blog, and even Muslim Brotherhood kind of join. You identify that some youth wing of Muslim Brotherhood are less Islamist. They are kind of light green, not so deep green. And they are connected with the whole Kafaya. And this is just by 2009, Egyptian blogosphere is the largest one. Actually, like a third of Arabic blogosphere, or even more, almost like half of this. But what is interesting is that the Kafaya Youth for Change, right? It's this youth version. They want to be more popular. They took on Facebook in 2008 and starting to take all strategies of Kafaya, introduce new thing. They understand the weakness of Kafaya was they was limited to inner circle, right? How to embrace larger group, how to embrace weak ties, people with weak tie association in sociology, from strong tie and connect to weak ties. And Facebook is a good way to do it because you get just these young people, and when everybody click like the group, and then 10 of your friends like this kind of thing, you feel that you have to like too. You have to get to be cool, right? this is actually happening. Some people, I do research in Indonesia, and then some teenagers join certain social movement, and they said, well, you know, it's not cool not joining. All of my friends are there, and then I got this. Everybody keep like, oh, A and B are joining. Another friend are joining. You got to keep up, you know, right? So that's and especially true in communal society. So the whole culture, participatory culture, enter politics, where politics merging with the culture, the teenager youth culture, and that's a perfect combination to get the youth, which is big population, right, to engage. But especially becoming very popular after Arabic Facebook, which is in 2009 being launched. And so the strong tie and weak ties. And then, of course, there's some other things that are being introduced later on by we are all Khalid Syed, which is emotion, that breaking the fear. The thing is, people agree that we have to get rid of this regime, but we are afraid. As so many people got arrested, people got being killed. What this movement contributed to the movement is that the emotion and this intangible feeling, a shared emotion, that's also share hope that they actually could break the fear. If someone died, we could. The bravery of actually kind of help being spread collectively, right? And then the network is big enough. Wasn't as the kafaya was just too small. And in the end, on weeks leading to Tahrir moments, you needed to connect with all kind of media, cell phones, word of mouth, pamphlets actually play a very important role as well. Cabs drivers are there among the people who spread the news. What we see also, the changing of narratives, right? From anti-Mubarak, this is just, I will explain later, but, or not. This is just the discourse on the blogosphere. There is a changing from Kafaya moment, which is more abstract, so about democracy, human rights, to something tangible in after 2008. Something like close to the everyday problem of Egyptian. Corruption, torture, that's a tangible, right? Concrete, sheer contention. And certainly Tunis brings something sharp on the whole things. This is not only about corruption, but also we want something changed. Bold demand, down Mubarak, down. But also there is a element of claim making. There is an ongoing claim on the street. Without connection from online to offline, nothing's gonna happen, people just click. But there is this historical momentum that's being built, right? And also there is a convergence of intermodality, how to connect from online. And also there is aspect globalizing the movement. You got Al Jazeera, and then you got this all, Twitter is important, and then other media to support, to gain international support, so they are protected from the brutality of the government. I'm actually got my last slide. So the actual role of social media is that it provided space for the establishment of human agency, right? The expansion of social network for collective action. First, it sustained the old network, right? But also, it facilitated the emergence of new network of oppositional actor. Also, it facilitated the brokerage of various actors that were not connected in offline setting. It helped the diffusion of contention beyond the inner circle. It helped to expand the network by enabling the connection of strong and weak ties, and it helped to globalize the movement. But activists also had to accommodate by identifying right issue. What kind of sheer contention that work? The meta-narrative, right? I have to transform the narrative. And I also have to identify symbolic representation to unite the emotion of the people. And ultimately, routinizing the connection of online and offline to claim power, to make use the cascading information from online to the street. So all of this have to be there. And we could see actually clearly that Egypt definitely, like the previous speaker has said, has more space, opportunities for this. If you see the chart, it's all ICT penetration, mobile penetration, and Tunisia and Egypt actually are more likely, right? Even if you look before, things are more likely. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Excuse me, everyone. I'm Troy Schneider with the New America Foundation. Before we let Andres move to the next panel, just a quick housekeeping note. Know that some of you have had trouble getting onto the wireless. We set up a second signal that you can access if you want. The signal is future tense, and the password is future tense 140. So for those of you who are getting bumped off, future tense and future tense 140. Thanks.
Thank you, Troy. We're going to move on chronologically and conceptually to our next discussion, which I think flows nicely from Merlina's presentation. And this is entitled How the Arab Spring Begat a Deadly Summer. So let me introduce our moderator for this discussion, Catherine Zoff. Catherine? Catherine is a Schwartz Fellow here at New America. She writes about women's rights, religion, and the Middle East. Catherine lived in Syria and Lebanon from 2004 and to 2007, mostly in Damascus, and mostly writing for the New York Times and the Chronicle for Higher Education, which I've always been intrigued by. She's also worked at the Times Bureau in Baghdad in 2008. In recent months, you may have seen Catherine's byline in the New York Times because she was sort of pressed back into service to help yes, please, coordinate the Syrian coverage. Catherine is also working on a book on young women in the Arab world. And I now will pass the reins over to you, Catherine. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Andres. All right, so here today we have Aula Al-Rifai next to me is a Syrian youth activist. She was one of the organizers of the Syrian Opposition Conference that was held early last month in Antalya, Turkey, and she serves on the youth committee that was created at the conference. She and her family left Syria in September 2005 after her parents, who are themselves prominent Syrian dissidents, received death threats from Asif Shalkat, the brother-in-law of the Syrian president. The family received political asylum in the US. Aula is now a senior at the University of Maryland, where she's majoring in political science. Ahmed Al-Umran, in the middle, is a blogger from Saudi Arabia whose blog, Saudi Genes, is known for its incisive commentary on human rights, women's rights, and political issues in the Arab world. He began blogging in 2004 during his first year in college. He was awarded a scholarship to Columbia's journalism school and received his master's degree from the school in May. He's currently covering the Arab Spring for NPR, and he was recently named one of Foreign Policy magazine's Twitterati 100 list of most influential Twitterers. Foreign Policy called Ahmed the original Saudi blogger. And Andrew Tabler worked as a journalist in Egypt for 6 years and in Damascus for 7 years, up until 2008. He co-founded Syria Today, a quarterly English-language magazine on Syrian affairs. Andrew is presently a Next Generation Fellow at the Washington Institute, and his first book, In the Lion's Den, an eyewitness account of Washington's battle with Syria, will be published in September and can be pre-ordered on Amazon now. So thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Ahmed, I wanted to direct this first question to you. When we spoke the other day, I was a bit surprised to hear you say that before you started blogging in 2004, you didn't have much interest in politics. And I was very struck by this idea that rather than turning to social media out of an interest in political activism, that it was something about the discipline of blogging, about your engagement with social media itself that had raised your political awareness. And I wonder if perhaps you could describe your experience to us. And when you look at your generation of young people across the Arab world, do you feel that it's something about the medium itself, about the way people engage with social media that has helped to raise this generation's political aspirations?
Well, I think in my case in particular, it has a lot to do with the situation in Saudi Arabia itself, where you don't have a lot of politics, you don't have elections, you don't have civil society. People are not actually allowed to practice politics. And the way I grew up and the way I was raised, I didn't deal with politics. It's not something that my father or my family was talking about. And it wasn't until I started blogging and I, got to know this online community of bloggers and activists, actually at the beginning outside Saudi Arabia, in Egypt and other countries, that I, started to learn more about politics, and I got interested in it. I started to write about it more and more, and it became like the focus of my blog. But I think, the internet and social media is given this generation a great outlet and a space where they can express themselves, where they can engage each other and talk about these issues that usually or typically will be hard to talk about in the public sphere. We usually talk about politics, but in private settings where, very few people that you trust that you will trust that you can talk with. But now it's all happening online to the public to see, and this kind of change is taking a while for people to kind of like understand, especially the older generation. Like my parents find it crazy that I'm, online talking about all these important issues without getting in trouble for it. Not that I didn't or other people didn't.
You
but
have gotten in trouble for it, as I understand.
Anybody who would actually dare to do that knows for sure that they're getting themselves into trouble. But for me and for many people, I think the case is we know it's risky, but we also think it's worth taking the risk in this case because, reforming our countries and the future of our nation is something that is worth taking risk for.
Okay. Well, I was so struck by this, what you said about how this was a blog that you had initially started to practice your English, I think you mentioned, and that it was somehow the act of having foreigners write to you and explaining Saudi social issues to them that
I
made you
find it
re-examine.
amazing that when I started 7 years ago, I just started for fun and to practice my English. I never thought it would, I would still be doing that 7 years later. I didn't think anybody would care actually because, who cares really? I don't. But the thing about actually no, when you start to care about politics and human rights, you can't stop. That's the thing. Once you start caring about that, no matter how frustrated, no matter how bad the situation is, you can't just sit back and say, you know what, I don't care about this country anymore. You can't. You will keep doing it. And I think this is not just the case for me. This is the case for many activists and bloggers in the region. Mm-hmm. They, once they start doing that, they can't just stop and leave it behind them.
Does your family still think you're going back to your pharmacy training?
No, probably not.
Not anymore. All right.
They just hope I don't go to jail. As long as I'm outside, they're fine.
Then that'll be just fine. Okay, Aula, I was very curious to hear your opinion actually on the same subject based on your experiences as a Syrian activist. In many ways, Syria is such an interesting test case for the effectiveness of social media because there is no free, independent media in Syria. And until very recently, the Syrian government was banning foreign journalists from the country. So unlike the so-called Al Jazeera revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia, in Syria, all you had was social media. And I wonder if you feel that as a result, that Syrian activists had to use the medium differently, if they had to come up with more aggressive or creative strategies, than activists in other countries.
Certainly, yes, they have been very creative. Right now, because of the revolution, the only way to get the information out is through, the videos, and the people on the streets, the protesters, are using cell phones and, small cameras, and trying. And some of them are crossing the borders. For example, the people who were in Dara, I had the chance to meet some of them in Antakya conference in Turkey around 2 months ago, and they were crossing the borders to go to Jordan to download videos in internet cafes and come back and fight again or be on the street and protest and risking their lives. So, of course, the social media is unfortunately the only way to get the information out of Syria right now. No, yes, as you said, there's no news network on the ground, can cover the news there, because the government is a corrupt regime, is banning, not making anybody go inside. And even like there was a Al Jazeera reporter who was imprisoned there. They imprisoned her because she tried to cover some news. So the social media is almost 100% what we are doing, or relying on to get the news out, to show the whole world that, yes, there is a revolution in Syria, it's peaceful protest, and it's a war on the people because the people have no weapons and the government is attacking them and surrounding cities with tanks and killing people and children and arresting, and on a daily basis, hundreds of protesters. So we are using Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all of these social media, tools to help us get that, show the world that, please help us to get rid of this regime. We need support.
Sorry,
go ahead.
Didn't mean to interrupt you. I know. I wondered what it was like, at the conference in Turkey, suddenly meeting these people that you, as I understand it, you had only known via social media. Is that right?
Yes, it was a wonderful conference because it brought all the Syrians from all over the world, different countries, from the U.S., from Europe, from Arab countries, everybody who has been active, supporting the revolution. We had the chance to meet in Turkey, in Antalya, to gather there and meet face to face. Also, we had around 50 people from inside Syria. They escaped. They found ways to smuggle and get to Turkey to attend the conference. And many of them journalists and political activists and people who went on the street and were protesting. And many of them were shot. I saw several guys, unfortunately, with torture scars on their bodies, and one of them was shot in the leg while he was on the street, just saying peaceful protest. So these people are the ones who are doing this revolution, and they're doing a very important role. It's because of them all of this is happening, and because of them we are getting to know now that, there is a revolution in Syria. Also, what was the other question? It's about. I think you were mentioning if, they're risking their lives and.
Have you heard? Are you still in touch with the ones who have returned to Syria?
Some of them returned to Syria. I forgot to say that. Yeah, some of them were brave enough to go back, get out of the country, be in Turkey, attend a conference, and meet all these people, and be on the TV with their faces, with their real names, and then go back again to Syria to protest. And I was shocked. I asked them, like, are you serious? You're going back? I mean, you have been arrested and tortured, and you want to go back again, and you have this opportunity to stay outside and do something different. And some of them stayed outside. Many of them went back and said, we feel that we need to be on the streets there, and that's our role, and that's our responsibility. And they're very brave.
Oh, it's amazing. Andrew, you've written a great deal about Syria's traditional opposition, the older Marxists and Arab nationalists and human rights activists in Damascus. And when we spoke about your recent trip to the region, you were describing to me how struck you were at the contrast between these established opposition figures, many of whom have been participating in dialogue with the Assad regime and who still feel that dialogue is probably the right course, and this entirely new, bold, and very, very young opposition movement that is taking shape. Places like the Antalya conference. Ella was describing that this young opposition has no patience for dialogue and are saying basically that President Assad has to go and then they'll figure out what comes next. And I guess I wonder, how do you think that social media has shaped the style of this new opposition movement? And I guess why have they been so much more effective than this older group who have had so many years to organize themselves? And
well, there are a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, the protests in Syria are being driven by demographics. primarily. You know, Syria had one of the highest population growth rates in the world in the 1980s and the 1990s, and that was primarily because during the height of the crackdown by the Assad regime, everybody stayed home. I mean, the economy contracted, and no, I mean, you know, the San Francisco earthquake effect over the course of over a decade. Okay, so all of these young people are hitting the job market now. They're extremely tech savvy, and they spend, because there isn't a formal opportunity to express themselves on the physical plane. They've gone to the virtual plane. So they're the ones who. So essentially, what we're seeing here is like a sort of the equivalent of the United States or in Western Europe of 1968. And there's been a lot of talk about it. Is this 1979? Is it 1989? No, it's mostly 1968. And what that's allowed to happen is that what social media is allowed to happen is for those people to communicate with each other and to share their ideas. And they are protesting. They first started protesting virtually, and then went out on to the streets. And they're the ones who are driving the protests, and combined with local leaders, local religious leaders and sheikhs. The established opposition in the country, the traditional ones you had mentioned, as well as the exiled opposition, is not primarily driving the protests. The exiled opposition, the activists, are helping the protesters who are on the ground. But unfortunately, the established opposition is a much older generation. They prefer the regime and the status quo because they have a lot invested with it, even though they've been imprisoned and harassed over the years. And the problem with the exiled opposition is that they all don't like each other. I mean, intensely. And it's been a big problem. Now, they've made a lot of progress in the last 2 months, mostly with a lot of pressure from guys on the ground who are saying, like, look, you need to focus on the Assad regime, not on each other. And so it's that youthful vibe that's coming through social media, which is transforming not only the country, but also the way the opposition is organizing against the Assad regime.
Were there conflicts at the Antalya conference, I wonder? And there weren't any visible
seriously,
kind of
I'll be really honest, not just because I went there, but it was a very, very cooperative environment, and everybody got along, and we were expecting to, conflicts, not conflicts, but arguments, like disagreeing on a few, things, because at the end of the conference, we had to give a final declaration, and of course, everybody has different opinions on what the final declaration should say. So yes, there were some, disagreeing on a few points, but at the end, we all agreed on this is, the regime has to go. Bashar Assad has to step down. His vice president takes the, rules the country for a temporary period of time until the, transition government, so it was great. To be honest, it was the best week I had in a long time. Yeah, it was really great.
But I didn't mean to suggest that I think Antalya was also a big step forward. But there is tension within, yes, and this is something that the local coordinating committees told me directly, that really there's a lot of tension. But that being said, I think everybody now, very clearly, like the Obama administration, sees that they do not have an interest in the Assad regime remaining in power. That this is really, for them it's a systemic issue. That the system inside of Syria can't contain the spirits and aspirations of the people inside of Syria. And they just do not, and when you talk with some of these young activists, many of who are based in Beirut, and who are 22 years old, make me feel very young or very, very old. They just see it as self-evident. They don't see why anybody would see it any differently.
I just want to add a very quick point about the entire conference. It was a support body for the revolution, period. That's it. So just people gathered to support the revolution, and that's what every single person who went there, and the 31 people that got elected there to take care of the political or the follow-up of and other meetings, and so it was just a support body for the revolution. We were not representing anybody in Syria. The revolution itself on the street represents itself. We're just out to support them, to help them, to go for the youth committee. Since I'm a member in the youth committee right now, what we decided to do is that when everybody goes back to their country, they would lobby, they would protest, in front of the embassy, like we do a weekly protest here in Washington, D.C. since the first day of the revolution at the White House and the Syrian embassy here in downtown D.C. We go, we meet with congressmen and women. We try to reach out. We try to go on the media. So that's our role, to support the people inside Syria.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I guess to go back in time a little bit, Aula, I was wondering at what point during the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia did you and other activists start to feel that like this could happen? This could happen in Syria.
Yes, of course.
Like, was there a turning point for you, or and how did you then begin laying the groundwork for?
When the Tunisian revolution started, I was like, I wasn't sure if something similar happen in Syria or not. Even after Mubarak stepped down in Egypt, it was a big surprise for Mubarak to step down. Like, oh my God, he'd really stepped down. But there's a difference between Tunisia, Egypt, and Syria, and in terms of the revolution, in terms of the economy, in terms of the political situation, there are a lot of differences. So for me, when I was looking, following the news, oh my God, I wish that sometime in the future, I was saying to myself, Syria, something would happen in Syria. But I wasn't very optimistic until I saw the very first protest on the streets of Damascus on
tiny,
March.
Right?
Yes, it was tiny. But when they started saying, "You thieves, thieves," to the government, I was like, yes, something is happening, because we've been under dictatorship for 48 years. It's more than more than the president of Tunisia was ruling. He was just for like 30 or something, 20, and in Egypt around 30 years. We've been under, dictatorship rule, same family for 48 years. So, and the economy is very, very bad, and the situation in Syria is much more worse than in Egypt than in Tunisia. So, I knew that at some point the people are gonna, say, hello, we are here, we need our rights. So, but I wasn't very optimistic until it started. And when it started, it became bigger and bigger and bigger. And right now, the people want to topple the regime. And we never really, it was a surprise, but it was very, it's incredible right now to see how, I wish I was, able to go there and be on the streets with everybody else. And we need freedom. This regime, there's no way for reform. We don't believe them anymore. No, we don't trust this president. I don't consider him my president. He wasn't even elected legally. So yes.
97.25%
Yeah,
vote.
miraculous.
How can you argue with that? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
In a referendum. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, if we're talking about what it's like to, watch these Al Jazeera revolutions from afar, I know you were at Columbia while you were watching all this, but I know you're in touch with a lot of Saudi activists back home, and I'd, sort of love to hear your thoughts on how this, this is being viewed from the Gulf.
I think that, as Wala said, when things started, it was kind of like took everyone by surprise. Nobody saw that coming, and when things started in Tunisia and then in Egypt, from what I have seen online, from the people that I talked to, there was a lot of excitement in Saudi and the Gulf in general about what was happening in the region, because the people in the Gulf, like the rest of the people in the region, they also want democracy and freedom and justice, and they were happy and excited to see that change take place in Tunisia and Egypt. But I think some people got a little bit too excited, thinking that, oh, it's a domino effect. Now, Saudi Arabia is next. And, I think that this kind of excitement was a little bit premature. Like, people were drinking the revolution Kool-Aid and thinking that, if it happens there, it could happen here any day. But I think, yes, some of the circumstances are similar. As Andrew said, the demographics, the young population, the unemployment, the lack of freedom and dignity and justice, all of that is similar. But also each country has a different dynamic and a different situation. And monarchies in the Gulf has much more money to quell these revolutions and stop them from happening. As we have seen with Saudi Arabia, for example, it wasn't just that the Saudi government was supporting Mubarak. They welcomed Ben Ali after he was ousted, and
Maybe
they were
Assad
also
soon.
getting involved in Bahrain and Yemen
Yes.
and other places. So they were not just trying to stop the revolution from reaching their country. They're also kind of like resisting this wave of change in other places. And this is one part of it. And the other part of it is, as I said, by and large, people are still not politically aware to the degree that allow them to do that, to demand their rights and ask for freedom and justice like the rest of the region. So, we are seeing the first signs of this spirit happening online. We're seeing the first signs of people actually like publicly showing their dissent and their opposition to what's happening.
You mean
But
Facebook posts?
on
and this
Facebook,
kind of,
on Twitter, and
Okay.
in the blogosphere. But it will take some time before this public display of dissent online actually moves to the street.
I was sitting with you at lunch in Riyadh about this time last year, and you were describing to me how you called it the year of the campaigns last year. You said that people had gotten really into these petition campaigns to change different things, and were that there weren't really live meetings, but that I guess I wonder whether you see that as the first baby steps towards this political ability to organize politically that you were talking about.
Definitely, I think the internet is helping this kind of young community of activists to work together, communicate, get to know each other, and work on the issues that matter to them. And part of it, as you said, is collaborating on petitions and what they can do in the space that is available to them, because it's not easy because it is illegal to actually protest on the street in Saudi Arabia. Then the internet is kind of like the arena where these people and activists can go there and organize and collaborate and work together towards these issues. Now, how effective is that? How the government is responding to this? It's hard because if you mainly work online, and the government is still kind of like not very responsive to what's happening, because like in many other parts of the Arab world, you have a big divide between the population and the leadership. In Saudi Arabia, you have a very young population, probably 60% are under 30 or 25. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, you have leaders who are in their 80s and 70s. And these two generations are not speaking the same language. So it's really hard to kind of like, from the government perspective, they think that they're trying to reform and change things, but what they're doing is not matching the aspiration of the younger generation who really wants much more.
Could you give an example of the sort of thing that they consider to be reform, or?
Well, I mean, after what happened in Tunisia, we've seen the government offer, financial aid packages and unemployment benefits, and these small municipal elections, thinking that we're doing something, we're giving something to the people. But what we have seen people demand for in these petitions that you talked about, they were talking about much bigger things. They were talking about a constitutional monarchy and the rule of law and free elections and democracy and equality between the genders. So there is a huge difference between what reformers and these young activists want and what the government is offering them.
Yeah. I was looking the other day at figures on internet penetration in the Arab world, and probably not surprisingly, the Gulf countries like Saudi Arabia and the other countries in the Gulf region have some of the highest levels, much higher than in Egypt or Jordan or Syria or even Tunisia, and yet except for Bahrain, we haven't. So it'll be interesting to see what comes next. Andrew, I wonder. Do you think that this wave of revolution in the Arab world will have a lasting positive impact, or is there any part of you that worries that it could make things more unstable or even violent?
Well, it already has made
Yeah,
things
it has made
unstable.
things more
Yeah, I mean, it's
setting
inevitable. It's inevitable. Again, what we're looking at in the Arab world is something that, those of us who spend a lot of time there, and I think all Arabs understand and beyond, is what we're looking at there is systemic failure. And okay, so I guess if you live in the region for a long time, you're allowed to roll out Orientalist analogies, but it essentially gets down to the genie in the bottle. Okay, sorry, cut me a break. But it basically comes down to this: for the past couple of decades or even longer, people's lives have been transformed. Globalization has penetrated the Arab world like never before. You have the internet now, which allows people to communicate, just like it allows us to communicate. And people's aspirations and dreams and so on now constitute that genie, and it's huge. And there's a lot of substance to it. Previously, it was always under the radar, so to speak. And these regimes have not changed the size of the bottle. We call it here stability in policy circles.
I'm sorry, what?
Stability,
Oh, yes.
yes. And what it is that, well, these regimes just, they are as they are, and they're very stable, so therefore they're worth betting on. It's an important component, for example, to the peace process-based strategy that the Obama administration pursued with the Assad regime for 2.5 years until it came undone as a result of the protests. So now it's very hard to argue that regimes which do not fundamentally change over time and remain static are indeed stable, and they're not stable. Now, what's happening in Syria will continue. It's going to go on for a long time. It will become much more bloody, I'm afraid. Could it become sectarian? Yes. But the Assad regime is degrading. It's degrading for its own reasons. It's just unable to harness or to deal with the changing realities inside of the country. And I think it took a long time for the Obama administration to come around to this understanding, because first of all, it's very hard to get information in Syria and to verify it, but also just look at Bashar al-Assad's response to the protests so far. I mean, did anybody stay up or get up early in the morning for that March 30th speech, which we were told to anticipate? David Ignatius wrote a piece saying that there was going to be some kind of like white revolution, or he was going to pull a revolution on himself. He didn't promise anything. He didn't implement anything. Now, he has made some changes along the way, but now the protesters' demands aren't about corruption. They're not about these kind of changes. Now it's about, hey, Bashar, you got to go. It's very hard to
It's a matter
bridge.
of weeks, really.
Yeah. And that's been a big transformation, and that's the reason why you've seen the change in Obama administration policy over the last 48 hours, publicly, that is.
Okay. I guess, Ahmed, do you feel that? I mean, do you feel that the hereditary monarchies in the Gulf are more immune? Do you think that their rule is sort of more in line with the aspirations of people?
No one is immune. No one is. They would like to think they're immune, but no one is immune. And as we said before, the reality on the ground of demographics and the other reasons that triggered this wave of revolutions in the rest of the region also exist in the Gulf. The difference is that the Gulf monarchies have the oil revenues to use to kind of like delay that change from happening. But you cannot. Money is a short-term solution. Okay, these issues need fundamental solutions. You cannot deal with them with money, and at some point, money will run out. Okay, the oil revenues will not going to be there forever. So the only way out for these monarchies to actually, I'm not going to say resist this wave of change, but let's say to adapt with it and deal with it, is by changing themselves and maybe becoming constitutional monarchies and giving people more rights and give people more chance to participate and be part of the process of making decisions and governing themselves. And so far, most of these regimes, all of them, do not seem very eager to actually do that. They try to find another way to deal with it, as we have seen in Bahrain, for example. So they're not immune, but they would like to think they have time, and they're buying time with the money that they have.
Well, I wonder if there are any questions for the panelists from the audience. There.
Hi, my name is Adam Paramadi. I work on the stream at Al Jazeera English. We've received lots of great video coming out of Syria, and Ahmed, thanks for being on our show earlier this week. We've received lots of great video coming out of Syria showing the activists in the street and protesters, but it's been very difficult for us to talk to real voices on the ground, bloggers, people tweeting. We had one, I think, very prolific incident. The gay girl in Damascus turned out to be a hoax. So Aula, being a girl from Syria, I was wondering maybe you could shed some light for us on the difficulties that people face accessing net or getting their message out in Syria specifically.
Well, since, of course, there's a lot of difficulties. Opposition inside Syria are hiding from place to another because they're, going to their houses and asking for them on a daily basis. They want to arrest them. So it's really, really difficult. And when people go on the media or television, bloggers or activists or opposition figures, they're you won't be able to talk to them for a long time because they have to hide somewhere to talk to you, and they're very risking their lives. Internet cafes we're saying that the internet is helping us to get the information out, but also the government is monitoring the internet. It's not a favor from the regime that they're keeping the internet. They shut down the internet for a little bit, and then they went back and made it available to everybody, but they are monitoring people that way more. When you go to internet cafes, it's a little expensive to get internet at your house in Damascus or in Syria, in any city. So most of the young generation, they go to internet cafes, and when you go to internet cafes, you have to give full information about you, like your address, your full name, where you live, your phone number, and everything, so they can monitor you. And you can't go access all websites that you would like to access to. And if they feel something going on, they would right away arrest you from maybe that internet cafe. So it's very difficult. It is really very difficult. Some activists are doing is they're using, especially the ones who live on the borders, they're using, Turkish lines, cell phones, or Jordanians or Lebanese sometimes to talk to you, to the news networks, and say that, oh, this happened in Syria, but this is what's going on. So, but it's extremely difficult. It's becoming much more difficult every day. Yeah.
The lady in the green.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. I was wondering what particularly the speakers from Syria and Saudi see as a role that the United States, either government or private sector or civil society, can play in all this, and particularly what's the perception among the people who are out there in the streets about the United States and what they would like to see done. I think in the case of Saudi, where we're allies and we honor you here and yet we support your government, so I'm wondering how you see that. And in Syria, there was the action of the American ambassador going to Hama that seemed to have a very positive effect. Should that happen again? And what's the overall view? Thank you.
Ahmed, do you want to go first?
But at first I don't speak for people in Saudi, because I don't think that I represent anyone or don't represent anyone but myself. And I think that when it comes to the role of the U.S. government or what the U.S. government could do, there isn't much that they can do, actually, because change must come from within and from the people themselves, who should demand these rights and work to get them. So it's really hard for me to say what the American government or the American people or companies should do. That's their own thing. But I think in the end it's up to the people to decide what they want and how they should go about it. The only thing is, if the American foreign policy, the American foreign policy, people keep talking about how the United States government will always stand for human rights and for freedom of expression and freedom on the internet. And if they should make sure that their policy decisions are in line with these principles that they keep repeating and talking about, and not put the interest that might contradict with these principles first.
Paula?
Yeah, well, sorry, you mentioned that how do we, if we would like the Ambassador Ford, when he visited the city of Hama last week, yes, we saw, if any of you saw the videos, the Ambassador Ford and the French ambassador, both of them were in Hama for the protest, to be there on Friday, because the Syrian tanks were surrounding the city of Hama, and they were planning for a big slaughter, a massacre that day. But the people on the streets in Hama, they welcomed both of the ambassadors with roses and olive branches. While we saw in Damascus the regime thugs throw stones and eggs and tomatoes on the American embassy and the French embassy, and even there are some injured people at the French embassy, I guess. So we see the difference. Yes, so the protesters inside Syria want international support. They want the American support, they want the European support, the whole world support to get rid of this regime. What the regime is saying, oh, you want the Americans to come inside and do what they did, like what they did in Iraq? No, we are against military intervention. That's not what we want. We want international support. What I mean by that is to take them to international criminal court, the regime, the Bashar al-Assad and his brother, and Asif Shaukat, the head of the security intelligence, and to freeze their assets and to, legally prosecute them. So we're not saying that, oh, we need American intervention, come inside and help us. No, that's not right. But we're very happy to see Ambassador Ford and the French ambassador to be there. And that's the only way that we were, to prove that this protest is peaceful and there's no violence from the protesters. It's a peaceful protest, and I said it's a war against the people, because the people don't have weapons, and the regime has all of the weapons, and they're relying on Iranian army as well and tanks to kill all the the peaceful protesters and children, even 13 years old and and younger. The very first couple of students who wrote on the walls of their school, Yasqut al-Nizam, which means down with dictatorship or down with the regime. They were 5-6 years old, and they arrested them and took them to prison. And they did horrible things to them, and they gave them dead bodies to their family. So, yeah.
I mean, just to add one bit, I think that the American foreign policy is walking a very fine line here, because even when simply they announce their support for these general principles, activists on the ground has to deal with it, because it usually has a negative effect, as we have seen. For one example is the woman drive-in campaign in Saudi Arabia, when Hillary Clinton came out and said she supports the right of Saudi women to drive. The conservatives in the country were quick to paint all these activists as westernized and being supported by the US, and they had to deal with that. So it's really difficult and tricky.
Andrew,
I would just add that it's very important that our actions don't play into the hands of the Syrian regime's spokespeople and spin doctors. I mean, you don't want to help Imad Mustafa out, okay, in any way, shape, or form. And the reason why Ambassador Ford went to Hama is because the Syrian authorities have acted in a completely appalling way. They were preparing to move into the city. This was not, as Syria comment suggested, some kind of play where Ford got to go to Hama to save his hide here in Washington from criticisms from the Republicans, and Assad moved the protesters in to go to scale the embassy walls to save face in Syria. That's ridiculous.
Yes, that's
American policy is not based on that. American policy is based on trying to promote freedom of expression and freedom of assembly inside of Syria, and that's the reason why Robert Ford went. And so it's I think I totally agree with you. It's walking this fine line because the regime and its supporters here in the United States would like nothing more to say, you see, the protests are all about the Americans and the Zionists and everything else. No, it's not about that. Obviously, it's not about that. Okay, it is about these systems being unable to accommodate their people's wishes and dreams in any kind of way that doesn't lead to violence and mass shootings and torture.
Well, I know that there was some feeling among the opposition that that perhaps the U.S. should withdraw its ambassador. Has that changed? That there should be a kind of a gesture on that scale, but it seems that.
We want sanction on the country,
okay.
Sanctions, of course, but I saw that it was a very smart idea from the American government to keep the ambassador right now to be able to visit and report. Well, throw out the Syrian ambassador here. Yes, I'm with that. And now there is a very, the FBI is investigating because they are spying on us, on our protests here in downtown DC. They're taking videos and threatening the families back home. So there is, if they can prove that, the Syrian ambassador could be thrown out easily.
The Syrian ambassador was demarched last week for this activity, for monitoring the Syrian opposition in the United States with cell phone videos and so on. And these, and there are many stories like this. It's not simply an embassy that's openly advocating for Syria here. There's a lot of mukhabarat monitoring that goes on from that embassy. That's just a fact of life.
This gentleman here in the second row.
My name is Alex from the Project on Middle East Democracy. I just was wondering, Ahmed, if you could talk a little bit more about the women driving protests in Saudi Arabia, maybe its context within the rest of the opposition, burgeoning opposition movement under, online, and I'd be interested in hearing what you had to say.
Well, the first women driving protest actually happened in 1990 during the Gulf War at the time, and during that protest, 47 women drove their cars and they were arrested, and they were basically publicly denounced, and they were fired from their jobs, and they were banned from travel, and they had to suffer through the years during the 90s. And now, after with everything that is happening in the region, all these revolutions are inspiring a new generation of women to revive the issue of driving, and that's why they decided earlier this year to set a date where women in the country will just start driving everywhere. It wasn't a mass protest. It was just an announcement saying, okay, from now on, women should just go and drive and see what happens. And what happened on June 17, the day that was announced for the driving, is that about 100 women actually drove around the country, and it went largely peacefully. The government did not arrest anyone. They stopped 2 women, and 1 woman got a ticket, but beside that, it went pretty peacefully. So women actually kept their campaign, and now they're basically saying this is ongoing. We will keep driving and see how the government will deal with it. The government has found themselves in this weird situation where they can't really do much because legally, there is nothing in the law that bans women from driving, but at the same time, there is resistance from the conservatives who think this change might trigger bigger changes. And we will see how if and when the government come out with an official position on this, because so far they have been really silent on it. But some people say that the government tolerance for the driving protest on June 17 and what followed might signal that a change might be coming soon, and the government might announce before the end of the year that the women driving issue is no more and will be solved once and for all.
I think we have time for one very quick question. Maybe this lady in turquoise? Here.
Can the panelists talk about the most effective ways in which online networks move into the real world and were translated into mobilization and street action, and maybe also some of the failures? Thank you.
I think that the woman driving thing is a really good example because it started mainly on Facebook and Twitter, and this group of women basically campaigned online, exclusively online, for about 2 months before that started. And some people at first suggested that this will fail because it's public. Because it's public, that means the government can stop it. That means that anything could happen to it. But these women have actually used Facebook and Twitter very effectively, because they campaigned for this for 2 months, and then on the day of protest, what they did, every time one woman drove her car, she would shoot a video and upload it online, and it will be on Twitter like in 2 hours or 3 hours. So it was really effective in this case, and they keep doing that. So, it can be really useful, especially in a place where, freedom of assembly does not exist, and people have to organize this way to make things happen.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. And I think we are out of time, but thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. That was great.